Welcome to Revolutions Weekly, where we dive into the details of our many periodic revolutions, elections. I'm your host Alvin, and today we're going to be continuing our series yet again about the 2021 Indian state elections. Now, at this point, like I said in the previous episode, we'll be starting our trudge down south. So, if we've been talking about the East Indian elections in the last 2 weeks before this, well, 3 weeks, I skipped 1 week. But anyways, so like I said, we've been talking about the West Bengal and Assam elections previously. Now we're finally going to start talking about the South Indian elections. So this week we're going to be starting out with Tamil Nadu. And I'm pretty excited for this one because, like I said earlier, this is like one of like my favorite Indian states. And just like in general, their politics is just very interesting. So let's get into it. So what exactly is going on in this particular election? Well, essentially what you have here is a battle between two parties. And no, it's not Congress versus BJP, which is exactly what makes this all the more interesting. Instead, what we have is the DMK versus the AIA-DMK. Now, if you're not familiar with Tamil politics, DMK essentially stands for Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, basically meaning Dravidian Progressive Union. And AIA-DMK is, the DMK part is the same thing, but it's AIA is All India Anna. Which Anna, of course, is Tamil for brother. And, we'll get to why that is in a bit. But anyway, so we have these two parties basically since, 1977, basically battling for supremacy within Tamil politics. And in fact, the AIA-DMK is actually a derivative of the DMK. So at one time, Congress ruled the state. Then eventually, in the 1960s, after the anti-Hindi agitations, if you don't know how, languages work in India, basically, English is an official language, but so is Hindi. But Tamil Nadu has been like the one state who's always been the loudest about being against an imposition of Hindi all across India. So that's why, today, if you to go to Tamil Nadu, you would find that, not as many people can actually speak Hindi. And not only that, within some segments of the population, there's even an active resistance against learning Hindi. But anyways, it was like in this particular movement against Hindi in the 60s that the DMK was actually able to emerge and like actually take power in the state. Hence, Dravidian as opposed to the North Indian Aryan. Whereas, the AIA-DMK, if you're familiar at all with the Tamil films, but if you are, it's okay. But anyways, here's what you need to know. Basically, there was a big Tamil movie star at the time named MGR, and basically he was part of the DMK. He was a passionate supporter of the DMK, but after new leadership stepped up, after, the first guy died, basically. So the first guy, his nickname was Anna, hence All India Anna, DMK. But so basically after he died, somebody else went up to his place, and his name was Karunanidhi. So he went up and he had disagreements with MGR. So then MGR basically went out and started his own party, the AIA-DMK. And after about 10 years of fighting in the polls, he finally got power in 1977. So, and that's the interesting part about Tamil Nadu politics as well, which is that, since the 1960s, every single prominent politician, every single, chief minister, which is like the governor position in any Indian state, basically, they've all been somehow related to the movie industry or the arts. So of course, Anna, the first leader of the DMK, he was a poet, he was like a script writer as well, he was a director. And then Karunanidhi was a poet and also, screenwriter, director. MGR, of course, big movie star in the 60s and 70s. And then, you also have, Jayalalitha succeeding him after, who was also a big actress at the time. And then, since Karunanidhi's successors after that, MK Stalin, who we'll get to in a bit, and, his son as well, they're also involved in movies at some point in their life, but not as much. So basically still keeping in with the actor to politician formula, but really, following that formula to a T, by literally making themselves actors only for the sake of politics. And you can definitely see this in just their general lack of prominence, as I said earlier, in the movie industry. And and in the AIADMK, you're also seeing a different trend as well. Well, we'll cover all of this in a bit. Anyways, I'm getting too long-winded. So, what are the big alliances in this election? So first of all, of course, we have the NDA, and this is the same National Democratic Alliance that the BJP governs with in the national government. But in this case, they're allying in the state with the AIADMK, so that's their primary coalition partner, and there's a whole bunch of other smaller parties. But anyways, the most important factors in this particular coalition is the BJP and the AIADMK. AIADMK, of course, being the primary partner in the alliance where they have the most seats and they're the one who's doing the actual governing, whereas BJP is merely kind of like allying with them in the state to to possibly gain a presence in the state and to also just in general just have any sort of presence in Tamil politics, because that's always been a bit difficult for BJP, being viewed as the ultimate North Indian party, the ultimate Hindutva party, an ideology drastically different to the atheist, quote-unquote, and secular values espoused by Dravidian ideology. Things, ideas, notions, which of course the Tamil people have been against, since the 60s, as evidenced by their, constantly voting for the DMK and AIADMK to power. But anyways, it's like with the BJP's alliance with the AIADMK, they're hoping to change that. But of course, this close relationship, both in the center and in the state, has kind of like made it so that the opposition has been able to put out this issue. Oh, and by the way, the AIADMK, in case you didn't know, is the current ruling party in the state. It's basically, so basically with this close relationship that they have, basically there's an issue that people like to put up, which is like, oh, the AIADMK is just being controlled by the BJP. Because since Jayalalitha died in 2016, basically, there hasn't been a proper leadership in the AIADMK. I mean, there is a leader technically, but is nowhere to like the level that Jayalalitha or MGR led the party, where it's like, where the party revolved around one charismatic figure, one, famous figure, one unifying figure. So you don't have that. So instead, now this alliance is led, and the government itself is led by, Chief Minister Edapadi Palaswamy, who was a minister in Jayalalitha's government, but because of conflict in one way or another, was able to rise up the rank and become the chief minister basically for the last 4 years. Basically, yeah, since 5 years, since like 2016, 2017, basically. So we'll get to that battle in a bit. But anyways, moving on. Now we have the SPA, which is the Secular Progressive Alliance. So in the SPA, this is the DMK's alliance. So you have the DMK, Congress, some smaller parties, and the Left Front. Congress, of course, being Indian National Congress, and the Left Front, of course, being several communist parties getting 1 or 2 seats here and there. So of course, like the DMK Congress alliance is really like a time-tested alliance, whereas the AIADMK BJP alliance is a very recent alliance. And things like, interestingly enough, previous leadership has, like denied an alliance with the BJP. And it was only a few years ago that the party leadership in the AIADMK became more open to the alliance and struck the alliance in the end, just a few years ago. So hence the issue with BJP controlling AIADMK and so on. On the other hand, the DMK and Congress alliance has actually been around, since basically MGR took power in the state. Because, like in 1977, when MGR with his AIADMK was actually able to take the state, it was a sweeping victory. And, the DMK, needing help to actually retain power, reached out to the Congress. And of course, like at the time called the Congress, led by Indira Gandhi, also wanted to see a DMK in power because, they were viewed as more trusted than this new group called the AIADMK. And it wasn't like MGR and later Jayalalitha was ever really fond of the Congress to begin with. And mind you, before the AIADMK entered the picture, Congress was actually the main opposition in the state. So them allying with the DMK is essentially them also trying to regain the status quo. So that's why, they fought several elections and they lost several elections, basically all the way up to MGR's death, where, where they weren't able to gain power throughout that whole time. And this is both of them fighting together to topple the AIDMK at the time, who was in no coalition. So of course, so now we're like starting to see Tamil politics reflect more and more, the national dynamics, albeit in a more, subdued way. And so and the fact that the two Dravidian parties are basically like the prominent players in this election kind of shows that that Tamil politics isn't really changing its veneer anytime soon. What happens inside is a different story. Anyways, the third alliance we have, and now we're getting to the alliances that basically have no chance of winning, at least not in this election. So the third alliance we have is the AMMK plus. AMMK, of course, in this case stands for Amma Makal Munita Karagam. Basically, basically it's like the Amma part of this is referring to Jayalalita, who, of course, her nickname is Amma, which means mother, right? Because during her administration, she was able to give out a lot of welfare schemes, a lot of appliances, and a lot of things like Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, free laptop. And that's the thing with Tamil politics in general, where it's since the time of MGR in the 1970s, you've kind of seen this uptick of essentially welfare politics, where it's the main platform of any party in a given election is, I will give you free stuff. I will give you free services. I will give you, this. I will give you that. And because they have to keep promising all these things, even before the election, they have to keep giving people stuff too. I think the Tamil Nadu elections, when counted by the cost of contesting on average a single assembly seat, is actually the most expensive election in India, which is interesting as well. Because they just have to keep giving stuff out before and after they win, basically. But that's not to say it's a bad thing entirely, because the state is, of course, one of the most developed in India itself. So you could say this kinds of this welfare scheme certainly has its benefits in terms of empowerment, in terms of development as well. But anyway, so how did a party called the AIMMK form? And this party was recently formed, and it was basically because of the internal AIA-DMK conflict I mentioned earlier, where Edapadi Palaswamy, the current chief minister, was able to emerge, but it wasn't directly. Initially, there was another person named O Pannirselvam, who was basically the right-hand man of Jayalalita. And basically, if Jayalalita was convicted of corruption, he would take her place, and once she was back, he would step down and she would come back in. And he basically did this a couple of times. And then there was also another person named Sasikala, who was basically a close friend of Jayalalita, who basically ended up being pretty much her advisor. Now, how much of an influence she has is debatable, but nevertheless, people were saying she was also a right-hand man woman of Jayalalita. But anyways, so as soon as Jayalalita died, there was this internal party battle for leadership, where so there was basically the O Pannirselvam faction, and there was the Sasikala faction. Now, I think increasingly at some point there's also an Edapadi Palaswamy coalition as well, as soon as he got appointed as the interim chief minister, because I think it's he was basically viewed as a neutral figure, and at some point after that, O Pannirselvam basically threw his support behind Edapadi Palaswamy, although it was a pretty tense alliance. But anyways, yeah, so Edapadi Palaswamy basically went up because he wasn't really viewed as a threat. I mean, at least not initially, because as evidenced by the fact that he didn't really have much of a standing before that. But basically, O Pannirselvam put his support behind Edapadi Palaswamy and basically expelled Sasikala out of the party. And so Sasikala basically started this new party, the AMMK, which is currently technically led by her nephew, but it's basically her faction of the AIA-DMK. And then lastly, we have the MMK, the Makalin Mudal Kutani. So basically, this coalition is led by the M and M. And this is a new party as well. It's the Makal Nidi Mayam. But unlike AMMK, this party has no affiliation with the older established parties. Instead, their whole platform is to go against the AIA, DMK duopoly in the state. And if you know Tamil cinema, you would also know an actor named Kamal Hassan. In case you don't know, he's also a famous actor, but he's famous in a later period. He's famous in like 80s and 90s. He's also famous now, but he basically started a party because, you know, as a lot of actors in Tamil Nadu tend to do, basically, and like his whole platform is basically, oh, I want to like instate a clean government in Tamil Nadu. So interestingly enough, he's not running on a platform of Dravidian politics. He's instead running he's not running on social issues. He's instead running on, you know, clear issues, which is like, yeah, I want to make the government cleaner. I want to get rid of corruption, you know, through, you know, like digitalization and all these kinds of things that he's like proposing. Which is, you know, I think it's like initially, you know, these were really good ideas, but eventually the DMK essentially stole his platform. So now, you know, he's losing his edge and, you know, I guess somewhat viability as a candidate. But anyways, it'll be interesting nevertheless, because this is like him and the AMMK, this is their first state election. So, you know, they're both essentially wild cards here. And, you know, they could get anywhere from 3 to like 15 seats, which will be interesting to see. And don't get me wrong, you know, like maybe they're not prominent players now, but if they keep at it, they might actually win something big in the future. We'll just have to see. And lastly, this is something I was looking forward to initially in terms of like, you know, like players and alliances. But I think it's like, if you also know Tamil cinema, there's also another famous actor named Rajinikanth, who's also famous around the same time Kamal Hassan is famous. So that means he's also famous now as well. He was initially floating an entrance into politics, but basically what happened was, right before he was about to launch his political party, he got sick. Then he basically told the press, oh, it's a sign from God, and so I'm just not going to go into politics. Dang. It was like, the thing is, I think it's like he would have been really interesting, because I think it's like, compared to Kamal Hassan, I guess Rajinikanth has a way more passionate following, and so that would have like really shaken things up in terms of like elections. But, you know, he's not going in, not this time, maybe next time, but I don't think so. He's getting too old, so yeah. But anyway, so like, what makes this election interesting and different compared to all the other ones? Well, this is essentially the first election without any iconic figures. Now, I've kind of alluded to this basically, you know, and this is especially the case, you know, with the AIA-DMK, which has always been reliant on iconic figures. So this is essentially the first quote-unquote equal playing field in decades in the state, basically, where, you know, you kind of have two leaders who are, you know, not obscure by any sense, but definitely not, you know, but not like big, larger-than-life figures, basically. So basically, before, you know, this particular election, and in the decades before, basically, you know, like I said, you know, you had the big movie stars in the AIA-DMK, then, you know, you also have like the big figures, the big larger-than-life figures as well in the DMK. So, you know, basically for decades, it was basically the MGR and later Jayalalitha battle against Karunanidhi, basically. But to be fair, even during this time, this was also a legacy battle. But it was a legacy battle for the legacy of Sinen Anandurai, also known as Anna. So, you know, the big reason MGR named this party AIA-DMK, All India Anna, was because he wanted to stake a claim to Sinen Anandurai's legacy, who is, of course, you know, the father of Dravidian politics. But although legacy battles aren't exactly anything new in politics, Tamil politics included, you know, the figures that we have in front of us currently, they can't exactly stand on their own 2 feet. You know, MGR, Karunanidhi, you know, these were big, larger-than-life figures. And even without any legacy battle, they would honestly do just fine. But this is not the case with MK Stalin and Edipati Palaswamy. So you find that both parties are extensively relying on their past figures, on claiming a legacy, because, well, honestly, that's really all they have. which kind of like shows that, they're in this limbo point, basically, especially the AIADMK with their, leadership struggles and conflicts and things like that. But, for the AIADMK, to be fair, this isn't the first time that they've actually had to deal with an internal conflict. So, like in the 90s, after MGR died, like Jayalalitha was the one who actually emerged. But there was another figure named Janaki, who was basically MGR's wife. Initially, she was the one slated to like replace him. And there was a whole thing where it's like, Jayalalitha got like pushed off MGR's funeral cart by her. And it's like they basically hate each other as a result. And it doesn't help by the fact that, MGR and Jayalalitha were really close. And of course, the wife's gonna be jealous, obviously. So there's that as well. But basically what happened in the end was Jayalalitha ultimately emerged victorious in that battle and became chief minister and leader of the party after that. So the current election is essentially, especially for those in the party, a fight for Amma's legacy, a fight for Jayalalitha's legacy. So she's basically like the main figure that they're trumping out in this particular election. And of course, like in the party, Edapadi Palaswamy is the victor. But if he loses this election and loses it horribly, there's an opening for other figures like O Panneerselvam or even Sasikala to make a re-entry into the party and to basically reassert their place in the leadership position that Edapadi failed to carry over. We'll just have to see what happens there. It might even end up ripping the party apart, which is going to be really unprecedented for Tamil politics, and it'll be really interesting to see. And as for the DMK, the issue is basically dynasticism or nepotism by the Karunanidhi family. Basically, like I said, MK Stalin is the son of Karunanidhi, but interestingly enough, his son Udayanidhi Stalin is also making an entry in this election, where he's also contesting for a seat. And another thing about MK Stalin, he has the same issue that Rahul Gandhi has. He's very sheltered. He doesn't have like that charisma. He doesn't have like that people connection. He's always very stiff. He always makes gaffes. So he has that going for him as well. So basically, what's carrying MK Stalin over is basically, the Karunanidhi line. It's like, oh, I'm Karunanidhi's son. That's basically his whole shtick. But, maybe that might be enough. And, with the anti-incumbency in Tamil Nadu, that might ultimately be enough. But anyways, let's get the polls. So, what is slated to happen in this election? And mind you, the election already happened, technically, a few days ago. So the polls basically shows that, the DMK, like I said, is slated to take power. And the indication of this is, of course, in the 2019 Lok Sabha election, 2019 national elections, they basically took all of the seats for Tamil Nadu. All of them. I think there's only like one or two that the AIADMK took for themselves, but the DMK took everything else. So, this big victory in 2019 shows that the DMK might be slated to go back to power after the last time they went was like 2011, just like 10 years ago. So they're finally going back to power. And then it'll basically be a fight between MK Stalin and Edapadi Palaswamy. So, between these two men, who is the greater leader, basically. And it'll be interesting because, in Edapadi Palaswamy, you have like an internal party figure who isn't like all that popular, like in the public. At least that's the perception. And, so he's not larger than life. But MK Stalin is also not larger than life. But MK Stalin, one thing he has going for him is that, like I said, he's Karunanidhi's son. So he's like the last leader's son for the DMK. So, but, like I said, he has the Rahul Gandhi issue, So he's kind of bumbling around, basically. So between these two figures, who will actually, emerge victorious? So that'll be interesting as well. And like I said earlier, anti-incumbency, every 5 to 10 years, what Tamil Nadu basically does is they just flip the government, no matter who it is. They just flip it. So then it's like, because, it kind of keeps both parties constantly at their feet, and meaning that both of them has to keep struggling to win the election. So it's not like a given where it's like, in some cases, Congress would rule for 10, 20 years, or the communist in Bengal, like I said a few weeks ago, was like ruling for 30 years. We're not going to have any of that in South India, which is what makes it all the more interesting. And lastly, the AMMK plus is slated to get about 3 seats, and the MNM is slated to have 5 seats. That's basically what it is so far. And in the votes so far, it's basically reflecting of this fact, where it's like, yeah, the DMK is basically slated to win back power. But in terms of like what the results are ultimately, we'll just have to wait till May 2nd. So, anyways, next week we're going to be continuing our trip down South India to the state next door, Kerala. And Kerala also has really interesting political trends and political dynamics players as well, so you definitely wouldn't want to miss that. So anyways, see you next week.